Hello out there. Here we are again, coming to you from Broadcast Team Alpha on 44 different platforms around the world. And my name is Aage. And my co-host Nori could not be here today. We're going to miss her. But we're going to see if we can manage to do it anyway. So I I would also let you know that we are also transmitting on Conscious Awakening Network. I want to give a shout out to those people because they have close to 50 different shows on that platform, all about the stuff that you're not supposed to know about. And go over there, the consciousawakeningnetwork.org, and have a look. I have done that and I really enjoyed myself over there. So you do the same. I think you're going to like it too. And I also want to let you know how you can get in touch with me or Nori. Go to broadcastteamalpha.com. That's our website. And then send us a message. We'll get the email and we'll get back to you and try to see if we can help you with something, whatever it is. And we have a phenomenal guest with us. And I was going to do an introduction, but it's almost unnecessary because I think everybody knows him unless you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years. And here we have Paul Anthony Wallis with us. And he is doing some really interesting things. And he's also got a brand new book coming out. And actually, it is out by the time that this recording goes live. He's a best-selling author, and his books they are going into the stories of mythology and spirituality that you hardly ever hear about. There is civilizations that comes and go away, a new one shows up. And he is diving into that to find out what really happened and what's going on. And I think that's probably good enough for the introduction because here is Paul Wallis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you once again.
Yeah, gosh. Oh, Nori's going to miss this.
I know. It's a shame Nori's not here, but I'm sure we'll have a fantastic conversation in her absence and we'll catch up with Nori next time.
Yeah. You are doing so many things. You got this new book now and you are going to be doing things for Gaia. And what are you actually, talk a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Well, this year is going to be a super busy year. I'm going to be in Peru and Bolivia and Turkey, filming with Matt LaCroix. I'm part of a stellar team that's supporting Matt in putting a movie together about human timelines, the timeline of humanity. And we're looking at evidence in the country that today is Turkey that I think will overturn a lot of our conventional thinking about human history and the timeline we imagine ourselves to be on. Matt and I were in Turkey last year with a smaller team, and while I was there, I was very gripped by the symbology of the ancient Urartian culture that lived there in the Bronze Age. And the Urartian culture, if people are unfamiliar with that word, the biblical version of Urartu is Ararat. That's the Hebrew way of saying that name. So that's the part of the world we're in, a part of the world associated with global resets. And as I looked at these ancient symbols carved into basalt 3,000 years ago, I realized that these symbols were carrying a story about a global reset thousands and thousands of years ago. So I've spent months and months in the world of ancient symbology, and it's what's resulted in the book over my shoulder, The Eden Enigma. And the tagline for that book is, "Do carvings in the mountains of Turkey carry ancient memories of ET contact from the dawn of civilization?" And people who know my work can probably guess what my answer to that question is. So I've been very busy with that. I'm recording with Gaia next month, and I'll be doing a lot of travel, preparing for the sequel to the Eden Enigma as well. So I'm I'm busier than I've ever been, really, but very much enjoying this research path that I'm on.
Well, that's the way you want it to be. Yep. And the kind of work I followed you a lot, and I watch your videos on YouTube and places. And I got two of your books, and I actually read them. And I'll tell you, it's the kind of books that once you start on it, make sure you don't have much on the schedule because you can't get out of that book.
Oh, that's what I like to hear. And there's such a strong appetite at the moment for information about paleo contact, ancient civilizations. I think on the fifth kind, which is my main channel on YouTube, our most popular video is a documentary about paleo contact. It's had more than 14 million views, and that's just on the English language version of it. There's a huge appetite for this kind of knowledge. And I note, for instance, Graham Hancock has got a second series on Netflix on the question of ancient civilizations. And that shows how mainstream the demand for this kind of information really is.
Oh, people are waking up in hordes. Yeah, I run into people in grocery stores, just people. And when I like to strike up conversations with people in grocery stores. And I have mentioned you, I've mentioned Graham Hancock, I've mentioned other people, and a lot of them, they already know about you guys. So it's mainstream. More than 10 years ago, it would not happen.
Definitely. There's been
Yeah,
a big
yeah,
shift.
yeah. We're talking about mysteries of the past, and there's one big mystery I would love to have your opinion on, and that is I found a video on YouTube that you did, and the title was Jesus an Alien? I would
Yes.
please speak on this for a moment.
Well, it's a video title that upsets a lot of people. And I should say, for anyone who doesn't know, my background is in church-based ministry. I was for 33 years in church-based ministry as a theological educator, training pastors, as a church doctor, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. That's one down from a bishop. And so it's somewhat extracurricular for somebody with my background to step forward and even put the question, might Jesus have been an ET, or might there have been an ET aspect in the story of Jesus? It is an absolute taboo, really, in modern Christianity to put all that language into one sentence.
Yeah.
But the reason I asked that question is twofold. Firstly, when Christians tell the story of Jesus, we often want to present it as if Jesus' story is absolutely unique and his birth stories are absolutely unique, but they're not. In fact, you've only got to read from the beginning of Luke's gospel to realize that the nativity of John the Baptist is almost exactly the same as the nativity of Jesus. They are both anomalous pregnancies resulting in
Yeah.
remarkable people. And those stories are modeled on an earlier story, a story from the Hebrew scriptures of another anomalous conception, another couple who can't naturally have children. That's the story of Abraham and Sarah. And through an encounter with non-human entity, all of a sudden, Sarah is pregnant and they produce Isaac, and it's a whole new dawn in the human story. So, modeled on that, we see Elizabeth, John's mum, has an encounter with a non-human entity, then comes the pregnancy. Mary, an encounter with a non-human entity, then comes the pregnancy. So, Jesus's story isn't unique even within the Bible. It belongs to this family of stories of close encounters. And then through my research, I've discovered for myself this is actually a global pattern. That if you listen to the birth narratives associated with Vipassi Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of the Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, or if you listen to narratives around the birth of the Yellow Emperor, same there. Narratives around the birth of Lao Tzu, same there. And this global family of stories we could call stories of star children or stories of indigo children. And the theme is always the same, either an encounter with a non-human visitor or an anomalous experience of light coming down from the sky and affecting the mother. And then the person who's born is highly intelligent, highly conscious, has a contribution that advances the human story in some kind of way. And if you don't place the narrative of Jesus's nativity in that wider context, how are you going to understand it? When we
Yeah.
place it in that family, we realize that a statement is being made that the progress of humanity is being curated, that every so often we're given a helping hand, and the helping hand is coming from non-human others. So that, in terms of mythology, that's the context of the story of Jesus's arrival. And it may be a taboo to say that, but that's just a fact that it belongs in that story of narratives. Some people might say, well, look, it's just a trope. It's just a literary device that's been dreamed up as a way of explaining why somebody is particularly clever or important. But you then have to ask, well, how did it become a trope? Why would people dream that up from culture to culture, century to century? Why do we have this concept of the star child? Why do we have this concept of external interventions to nudge human society forwards? And it's not just sort of our ignorant peasant ancestors who didn't know any better, who came up with these ideas and couldn't tell the difference between fact and fiction. You can find some of the greatest minds exploring these ideas.
Yeah.
And so Plato talks about the role of the gods, to use a translation of what he's saying, in advancing human society. Plato, one of the greatest minds in human history in terms of philosophy and science, he took very seriously the idea that we have non-human company very interested in the progress
Yeah.
of the human race. And the story of Jesus fits squarely in the middle of that family of stories.
Yeah. And then we have in, I think, a couple of three different religions where they talk about the shining ones. Obviously, they were not human, they were something else.
Yes, the shining ones is a very interesting way of describing ancient helpers, and it's language we can find around the world. Now, sometimes the helpers, when they're identified, are identified that way. Sometimes they're identified in an almost opposite way. So the Babylonian story of ancient helpers is the one reported by the Babylonian Greek priest Berossus, who talks
Hmm.
about the sages, the Apkallu, who came and taught our ancestors agricultural science, civil engineering, city building, money systems, banking systems, mathematics, science, all the accoutrements of civilization. But Berossus says that when our ancestors first saw the Apkallu, they were horrified and describe these beings as some kind of monster. So you've got that at one end of the spectrum, some kind of monster, and then the beautiful shining ones at the other. But
Yeah.
right across the spectrum of descriptions, the theme that repeats is non-human others who came and taught our ancestors how to survive and thrive and progress and become a civilization.
Yeah. Yeah, I studied Baras's some, and he wrote another one. It's a history of the world, where he gleaned a lot from the Sumerian tablets, where he created that document, and that is incredible reading what he wrote there.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And how, let's say, how did it start? Let's say for the construct of the Eden Enigma all the way up to now. How did you fit it all together? Did it come over a long period of time, or did you have bits and pieces that you tied together? And
Yes, it really did evolve. I was really moved by my visit to Turkey last year and the places I visited and the history that they hold. And I knew I had to share something of that experience. And I thought, when I get home, I've got to write a travel book so that people can have the experience of going to these extraordinary places with me, because many of these places have yet really to explode in the world of international tourism in the way that, for instance, the sites of Sacsayhuaman or Pumapunku have exploded, or the Giza pyramids. Everybody knows about those. Everybody wants to go to those. And the sites in Turkey and Armenia are less well known, but every bit as important in helping us to understand the human
yeah,
story. And so I knew I wanted to share the experience, share those places, for it to feel like a travel book. But I knew that the really important thing that's here is the stories that the region has retained in the folklore and in these ancient carved symbols and in the cuneiform inscriptions left behind. And so I had to sit with those a long time and puzzle over. That's why I call it the Eden Enigma, because I'm puzzling over what's really an ancient code and wanting to decode what's the message in these symbols, what's the story underlying these symbols. And
mhm,
as I say, the region is known for stories of a global reset. So whether you're reading the biblical story of Noah or the Armenian history by Moses Koronatsai writing in the 400s, or whether you're listening to the Mesopotamian story of Ziusudra, or whether you're reading Greek and Roman historians talking about the beginning of the Iron Age in this part of the world, all these vectors, you might be reading Snorri Sturluson, the post-Viking chieftain who in the 1200s was writing the history of the Aesir, the gods of the Norse people. They all point to this part of the world. They all suggest a global reset and then a migration of agricultural science and megalithic building from there around the world. Now, I knew something about those narratives, but as I went to these sacred sites and looked at these ancient symbols, I wanted to know, do these stories relate to those ones? Does the local hard copy evidence support these ancient stories? And I found that they do in the most incredible and detailed and specific way. That's the journey I share in the Eden Enigma.
yeah, and you say these symbols, they outlast civilizations, they outlast religions. They are, yeah, okay, they're carved in stone,
They're
many
set
of
in stone. That's right.
them. Yeah.
And one of the confronting things for me is after 33 years in church-based ministry, I'm very familiar with the symbology of Christianity. So I'm very familiar with the cross and the sun cross, which is the cross in a circle. And you'll find the sun cross embossed onto the communion wafer. You'll find the sun cross on the ciborium that holds the communion wafers. You'll see the sun cross behind the heads of Jesus and Mary and the saints whenever they're portrayed in iconography. you will see the sun cross and a grand image of the sun in the monstrance that's held up for the Catholic ceremony of benediction. There are all these references to the sun cross. And somebody walking in who didn't know anything about high church Christianity would sit through some of these ceremonies and think, well, this is all about sun worship, which is how a lot of historians have interpreted this symbol, this cross in a circle, or this cross with circular edges, or the swastika, which is a cross with wings that suggests this rotational movement. But I found through my research that the ancients were not necessarily into what we would call sun worship. That their relationship with the sun was more intelligent and more sophisticated than that, and that the symbol also refers to artificial objects in the sky, and it ties into experiences of contact that changed human history. And this symbol representing craft, and we can get very specific, a craft large enough to carry two people, a craft that can land in a field, a craft that can be examined and touched by others. That's part of the symbological stories from out of Bronze Age Sweden. And we shouldn't be surprised to find the symbols there, says Snorri Sturluson, because they migrated there from the lands of ancient Armenia, Turkey and Armenia. And we find the same symbols there. And so I just go into the mystery of that symbol, a symbol that I had thought Christianity had invented, but it actually inherited from these other stories that were thousands of years older than Christianity. And many of the associations that Christians have layered onto the cross, even those associations were there before Christianity. So the idea that this cross represents a being from the heavens, a being who is preeminent, a being to whom you will bring your tithes and offerings. All those associations are there before Christianity, and then they get imported in. So that's just one example of symbols that I was very familiar with that turn out to have a far longer story than ever I'd imagined.
Yeah. Yeah, you go quite deeply into those stories. And in fact, me being born in Norway, you even talk about Snorre Sturlason, the Icelandic diplomat and politician and poet and writer. He pretty much have written the Viking history. I got two books of him on my shelf somewhere, and they're really interesting stuff. Because
Yes,
Vikings didn't write down much. They just didn't, but he did.
that's right. So the stories had been told for a long time, and then Snorri Sturluson, who really was a Renaissance man, we could call him, decided he needed to get a really good record of these stories for posterity. And it's through him that we know many of the
Yeah.
Norse legends. And I found it very interesting going to Snorri Sturluson after seeing some of the extraordinary sights in Turkey. And I should give a shout out to my friend David Lovegrove. He has a channel called Viking Superpowers. And this year he's
Oh,
publishing a book on the subject, Viking Superpowers. He's the one who got me onto Snorri Sturluson, and I realized that many of the phenomena I was seeing in Turkey and that I talk about from Armenia in the Eden Enigma can be illuminated by what Snorri Sturluson had to say about those same symbols in the 1200s. And I'll give you an example. One of the places I went to in Turkey last year was right on the edge of the city of Van, a site halfway up a cliff, a giant doorway that's been carved into the limestone cliff face, and it's triple inset. And when you see the triple inset, you know that's a code for something. And it's really a code that's saying this is not the usual three-dimensional kind of doorway. There's another dimensionality to this kind of doorway. And it's called a meher kapi, a light gate or a bright doorway. And the local mythology is that Haldi, the leader of the Tingir, and the Tingir were the advanced beings who came and helped their ancestors make the great leap forward into agriculture and city building. that Haldi and the other Tingir would come and go through bright doorways like this one. And when I first heard that story and saw the carving, and the local kings are very proud when they build a citadel, they'll say, I built this citadel and I built a light gate for Haldi, a bright doorway for Haldi. And as I listened to these stories and put them together, the story is this is how the Tingir come and go. And I puzzled over what a light doorway is, why they would arrive on a beam of light.
Yeah.
And initially I was thinking, oh, is this like a portal? Is this like a teleporting system? Is this like fairies arriving on a beam of light? Or is this like the beaming system of Star Trek? That was where I went to when I first heard the stories. But then when I went to Snorri Sturluson, he tells the story of King Svegdir, who one day finds an anomalous object on his property. He describes it as a boulder that he's never seen before, but this smooth boulder is about the size of a house.
Oh.
And then a door opens in it, and there's a bright beam of light that comes out from that door. And then King Svegdir goes in with another being into the boulder and is never seen again. Now, let's just picture this. Here's this object the size of a house, and when the door opens, there's bright light. Well, in a culture that has never seen artificial lighting, if you see a craft that has artificial lighting and they open the door, that's exactly what you're going to see. Really intense bright light, and that's where the Tingir come from. And then when they return home, they'll go back through that doorway into the bright light again. And so putting this alongside other aspects of Urartian story, I think we've got a memory of ancient technology, a memory of artificial lighting, and a memory of advanced people coming and going in craft that had artificial lighting.
Yeah.
And it's a motif you can find in other ancient story that I think a coherent picture begins to build up. And sometimes we can miss the language of ancient technology because we're so habituated to listen to folklore as if it's a metaphor or as if it's a moral story or a fable of some kind. But the moment you listen to the stories and picture it and then ask, what did I just see? That's when we realize there are other ways of describing these things. So that's just one, for instance, of how this family of story hints at contact with advanced others in the deep past.
Yeah, when he said boulder, when you see something strange like that, you have to associate with something that fits in your paradigm. So, well, it's big, it's round, it's a boulder, right? No. Can we
Exactly.
spell UFO? I mean,
Yes.
that's that's probably what it was.
I can give you another example of that. How would you describe a flying saucer 3,000 years ago? Well, if you look at carvings, you could go into Persia, for instance, to the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal II, and exquisite carvings of Tingir and Apkallu and deities, beings that archaeologists often refer to as genies. You look at those carvings and you will see flying discs. You can
Yeah.
see their discs because they're shaped that way, and you can see they're flying because they've got wings on them. And you can see that they're craft because you can see a person inside it. So there's the symbological language for a flying disc in Persia.
Mhm.
If you go to Yerevan in modern day Armenia, you will find a fortress that was built by King Agisti as a celebration of Urartian power, a celebration of Urartian culture, the United Kingdom of Van, and as an intimidation of its enemies. And there's a beautiful work of art from that fortress that survived to the present day that shows a blue sky full of flying discs. But they don't use the language discs and they don't use the language flying saucers. They use the language of flying shields because Urartian shields were circular in shape. And in fact, if you put them sideways on and look at the profile, it's the exact profile of a flying saucer.
Yeah.
So, of course, they would liken a flying saucer to flying shields, and they're not the only culture to do this. Livy, the Roman historian, talks about flying shields intervening in Roman military campaigns. And then there's a story told of Charlemagne, the Battle of Sigisburg, which again was attended by flying shields that intervened in this situation, or at least spooked everyone who was involved in this military situation. And I find it interesting if you think about the Battle of Sigisburg, you think about Roman military campaigns. The Urartians were always in military campaigns. I don't know what these discs did in terms of affecting the outcome of a battle, but they seem very interested to turn up when there's that kind of conflict going on. We can think about this in the modern era. We can think about the Foo Fighters turning up in the Second World War. We can
Yeah.
think about the modern spate of flying saucers, which arrived at the end of the Second World War, just as we were beginning to nuke each other. And I wonder if there's a common theme there. But in Yerevan, in Armenia, in the Urartian story, the flying shields in the blue sky at Yerevan are not associated with war, but with turning up and helping their ancestors survive in a moment when human survival was hanging in the balance. And that was
Yeah.
right in the aftermath of the most recent ice age. And that's where the story of the Tingir really gets interesting.
Absolutely. Because we have had helpers for a long time. And
Exactly.
they help in their own way. And if you start looking back in paintings and carvings from thousands of years ago, there are even statues, carved stone statues that look exactly like a grave. There are many of them in the Far East, not so much in South America, but they have a lot of stone carvings about flying discs. They're still here,
Yes.
aren't they?
Yes, it is a global story. Yes, I think we still have company.
Yeah,
And I think the company we have today is as much a spectrum as it's been in the past. I
yeah,
think we've got many visitors who feel they've got a stakeholding in Project Earth, and some of those factions may be friendlier than others. But I
yeah,
do think we have factions here who are very interested in and concerned with humanity, concerned with our human future, and who are a restraining force in the picture to ensure that we have a happy future to look forward to. And it's
yeah,
that side of the story that I found being told by the ancient Urartians.
yeah. And I see we're down to the bottom of the hour. So for those of you that joined us late, we are talking with Paul Wallis, and we are talking about ancient symbols, ancient stories, ancient mythological stories that is starting to look like they are coming true. They're real. And he is writing books about this. And mention that last book again that they can find on Amazon. Mention a few
Yes.
things that they can find in there.
Well, if you go to Amazon, you will find the Eden Enigma. And the subtitle, the tagline is Do Carvings in the Mountains of Turkey Carry Ancient Memories of ET Contact from the Dawn of Civilization? And in that book, I explore the symbols left behind in the mountains of Turkey by an ancient culture that was telling a story that was already thousands of years old. And they carved these stories into the hardness of basalt, which ensures that the story survives for thousands of years after their own time, so that cultures like us, who probably know very little about the Urartian people who left these carvings behind, can go and puzzle over their symbols and read their cuneiform inscriptions and tap the wisdom of our ancestors who are telling a story that is all about the surviving and thriving of the human race through all kinds of planetary challenges. And one of the deep stories of that region has to do with the most recent ice age, how it impacted the human story, and then how human beings recovered from that trauma and began to build civilization again. And that's really the central theme that I explore in the Eden Enigma. But we go to other places and we find evidences for that story in DNA research, in archaeological research, in the field of paleo agriculture. We go to other narrative traditions from the Norse stories, from ancient Persian stories, and we go to megalithic sites in Turkey and Armenia, down into what is Iran today. And we find that the stories told by the Urartians have international support and share a story that was part of an international worldview that predates every religion you could name on the planet today.
Yeah.
And they wanted this ancient knowledge to survive,
Yeah.
to inform us, not only so that we would know how to thrive and survive on an uncertain planet, but so that we would have an intelligent idea of how to engage with cosmic company should it ever become apparent again.
Absolutely. And what you write about is not channeling, this is science and old records that hardly people have ever seen before. So this is something that it sets it aside from many, many other authors that write about these things. And then we have Elohim of the Bible. Speak on that, because a lot of people have heard the word Elohim, but very few really know what it's all about.
Elohim is a fascinating word. It's the oldest word in the Bible that gets translated as God. But when I began researching for the Eden series, I realized that that is not the original meaning of the word. If you go to its root meanings, the component parts of the word Elohim mean powerful ones. And once I saw that, I asked myself the question, what happens if I reread the Elohim stories, but use that root meaning, powerful ones? And of course, the stories change, but they don't change in a random way. As I went through that exercise, I realized that the Bible stories of powerful ones run in parallel with the Mesopotamian stories of Anunnaki, and that
Yeah,
Elohim is really the Hebrew way of saying Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki stories are not about God, they are about sky people, advanced people who came from the stars to planet Earth, colonized it for a period, and governed over our ancestors. And once I'd realized that in the Bible I was reading the summary form of these earlier Mesopotamian stories, it was like taking the red pill in the Matrix. My whole world changed. Now, I wasn't the first person to spot this dependence of the Bible on the Mesopotamian sources. In fact, if I'd read the footnotes in many of my scholarly Bibles, I could have found out a lot quicker because the Bible translators know this. But we've only known it since the 1800s, because that is when we discovered the translation key that allowed us to decode all the script that had been discovered on these cuneiform stone tablets from the long lost cultures of Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, Assyria. And for centuries, as people dug these tablets up, they weren't even sure if it was language carved into them. They thought it just might be random decorations. And then in 1835, Henry Rawlinson of the East India Company found the translation key in Iran, the Behistun inscription. It provided a translation key because it was written in 3 or 4 known languages in cuneiform script. So there was the key, a bit like the Rosetta Stone for interpreting Egyptian hieroglyphs. And they went back to these tablets and then began recognizing the source narratives of many of the God stories of the Bible. So the word Elohim refers to these powerful ones And suddenly it makes sense that the powerful ones talk to each other. They say things like, let us make the humans to look like one of us.
Yeah,
Well, when that's translated as God, it doesn't make sense. When it's the powerful ones, that's
yeah,
who's having the conversation. When the Elohim conflict with each other and go to war against each other, now it makes sense because there are many Elohim. When they turn up as the Tseva Hashemayim, the sky armies, the airborne armies in the plural, suddenly that makes sense. The fact that Elohim are named, Milcom, Chemosh, Dagon, Asherah, suddenly it makes sense when you get to the Ten Commandments. And Yahweh says, I don't want you serving, working for any other Elohim. Suddenly it makes sense. He's one of many. When he's jealous of the Elohe, which is the singular version of the word, the Elohe of Ekron, suddenly it makes sense. Yahweh is one of many Elohim. When you read the story of the Ba'adat, the power council, and El Elyon divides the lands up among the Elohim, except Yahweh gets a people group with no land. So his first act is to go into somebody else's land, Aage of Egypt, and get his people group out of that land. And then he's got to go to war with other Elohim so that his people can have some land. None of these stories make any sense if you think Elohim means God. These stories only make sense when you realize there's this plurality of beings jostling against each other for resources and hegemony. These are the stories of the Elohim in the Bible and the stories of
yeah.
the Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian corpus.
And then there are people that claim to know or say they have read and understood that the God of the Bible is Anunnaki.
Yes, now the parallels are such that you can't always make a direct equation.
Yeah.
So I often have people say to me, oh, yes, I worked out a long time ago that Yahweh in the Bible is Enlil in the Enuma Elish. And it doesn't quite work that way. Yahweh takes the role of Enlil in Genesis 3, the story of the human upgrade.
Mhm.
Yahweh takes the role of Enlil in Genesis 6, when Enlil decides to get rid of human beings through a flood. But in Genesis 6, Yahweh also takes the part of Enki, who rescues Noah and
Mhm.
his family, aka Zusudra, aka Utnapishtim, aka Artrahasis. So you can't equate one set of stories with another, but what
Yeah.
you will find as you read the Mesopotamian stories is I recognize the stories, I recognize the themes, I recognize the struggles, and I can see that one is a summary of the other. So it works that way rather than sort of verbatim repetition. It's clear to see that the Hebrew writers knew the Mesopotamian stories like the back of their hand and are playing with them and adapting them, first of all by summarizing them, and then at a later stage, in the 8th to 6th century BCE, rewriting them to try and turn them into monotheistic stories, except that the language and the shape of the stories gives away you're not reading the original version. So that's the journey I take people on in my books, Escaping from Eden and the Eden Conspiracy. And in the Eden Conspiracy, I show that the rewriting of those stories, the story of that rewriting is told in the Bible itself. So it's not me making this up. If you read the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, 1 and 2 Kings, Ezra, you'll be reading about this narrative transformation of Judaism from a canon of paleo-contact to a religion of monotheism.
I want to say something to the listeners and the viewers right now. That if you ever get yourself in a really deep discussion with someone about religion, you need to have read Paul's books because now you got meat to bring to the table in your discussion. Absolutely. And you also talk about real world evidence of extinction events. And some of the records of carvings and stuff may have come from a previous civilization that maybe just went away.
Yes, that's right. The most recent planetary level, extinction level event would be the Younger Dryas Cold Period, the most recent ice age.
Yeah.
And there are many stories from cultures around the world that seem to carry a cultural memory of that. So we've certainly got that in the Urartian stories and the symbols they left behind. You've also got it in the Persian stories, the pre-Zoroastrian stories of Jamshid and Yima. You've got it in the story of Noah, references to the fires and the floods and the great and terrible winter of the Younger Dryas. So we've got quite a lot of stories pointing to that moment. I would argue the Babylonian story of the Apkallu belongs to that period as well. But it's not the only extinction level event we've had to face and where we've needed help. And so another interesting moment would be possibly around 60,000 years ago. We have stories in Aboriginal Australian lore that points to a time when Aboriginal Australians, who are renowned for their profound relationship with the balance of the Australian ecosystem, they tell stories of a time when that wasn't the case, when they didn't know how to live off the land. They didn't know what plants were good for food and which were good for medicines and which were good to avoid. And they didn't know how to hunt and they didn't know how to fish. And this is a mysterious story, for instance, told by the Yolngu people in Australia's Northern Territory. And they speak of this time when clearly they're not going to thrive. Doesn't look like they're even going to survive. And you have to wonder what's happened for that to be the case. Have they had to migrate to somewhere where they just don't know the environment? Or has something happened to them that means they're now out of kilter with their environment? Because if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, and the ancient stories of the development of humankind, you've got moments like that where human beings aren't animals anymore.
Yeah.
Human beings don't have fur anymore. Human beings can't eat the foods they ate before. And so you wonder how ancient this story is, but it's at least 60,000 years old. The Yolngu story speaks of the Mimi spirits coming and helping their ancestors. Now, a spirit doesn't necessarily mean something non-material. Lots of ancient cultures, when they use the language of spirit, are simply talking about a being or a person who can show up and leave in ways you don't understand. So if somebody teleports into your room, they must be a spirit. Or if
Yeah.
someone gets into a boulder and flies away, they must be a spirit. If they come from the moon, they must be a spirit. So don't be put off by that word. This is Mimi beings. And the Yolngu people say they learned from the dance of the Mimi, the dance of the hunt, the dance of the fishing, the dance of the harvest. They learned how to live on the land. And I think that's a beautiful way of simply saying they observed and learned from their tutors because they didn't have a shared language. So it was a matter of watching, observing, doing it together. This is how they learned. This is how they survived. And a very similar story is told by um, I think this is the Mohawk people who speak of a time, again, they're in an environment where they don't know how to live off the land. So either something has happened to the environment, there's been a cataclysm or bizarre weather patterns, or they've had to move somewhere they didn't live before, and then mysterious others show up and show them how to hunt, what to eat, what to avoid. So we've got those stories that seem to be from a period at least 60,000 years ago, and that may hint at another extinction level event. 42,000 years ago, we've got another extinction level event that was triggered by a weakening of the planet's geomagnetic field. And as that happened, the North Pole started moving. It's called the Lachamp excursion, and the North Pole moved all the way around to the South Pole and then back again. And you might ask, so what? As long as you're not looking for directions, would that make any difference? Well, it made a huge difference. The
Yeah.
diminishing of the Earth's geomagnetic field meant that all of a sudden our ancestors were being bombarded with levels of ultraviolet light they had never had to deal with before. And it explains why in that period, 42,000 years ago, our ancestors all around the world started plastering themselves in earth. In Australia, they started plastering themselves in red ochre, for instance. Why? Because that's your sunscreen. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, we see human beings start moving indoors and start moving into caves when they'd lived outdoors before. Can't do it now because they're being bombarded by ultraviolet light and they're getting sick. And not only do we find those changes, but we can look at the art that they left behind. And the
Yeah.
art that they left behind was of an ecosystem that was vanishing. So if you go to France, to the caves in the Dordogne, to the caves of Lascaux, you will see an ecosystem described that is nothing like modern France. You'll find the same at the caves of Chauvet, where you've got uh, rhinos, hippos, lions, bears, all kinds of animals that you would associate with Africa, India today, but not France. But they were all there up until this extinction level event. And they're recording this world that is vanishing. And they're wanting to sort of mark for posterity. This is how this region was before everything changed. And it's the most exquisite paintings of these animals they've left behind. And then in the middle of these beautiful, and it's absolutely representational, you know what animals you're looking at, somewhat stylized, but you know what you're looking at. But now there's a symbol. And the one symbol you can see carved there is a cross. And it might be the first cross from 42,000 years ago. And that cross, if you think about what the most primitive meaning of a cross would be, I think it's saying this is when everything changed. Because if you have a horizontal line, well, that's us sort of moving through time. And now comes a vertical line. Something from above is connecting with what's down here. Something from beyond is now impacting our world. And what has come down cuts our timeline into before and after. And I think it was a way of saying this was the world before everything changed. X marks the spot, X marks the time. And so that is one of a number of extinction level events in human cultural memory. And I argue in the Eden series that every one of these traumas left behind a scar in the human psyche and left behind stories that would be remembered. That when we read the stories of Noah, Jamshid, Yima, when we read the stories of Haldi and the other Tingia arriving, when we read the stories of the Mimi spirits, what we're actually hearing is memories of our ancestors who survived a terrible trauma. And they want to tell us they survived. They want to tell us how to survive ourselves, but they also want to honor the helpers who came and got us through those moments. And that's the story I explore in the Eden Enigma.
Yes. And you're talking about 40 some thousand years and then 60,000 years. And then we have perfect human footprints in stone next to dinosaur prints. So now we're
That
moving
throws
it
up a
back.
lot of questions, doesn't it?
Now we're moving it way back into the ancient history.
Yes, we are. I mean, that really throws a spanner in the works. And I argue that by the time you've got to chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, we've probably read about 5 planetary resets. And that
Yeah.
some of those stories long predate everything we know about Homo sapiens on planet Earth.
Mhm.
And if we've got any kind of information about, for instance, a society living on Pangaea, which we do, I argue,
Yeah.
in Genesis 11 and Genesis, I think it's from Genesis 9, 10, and 11, there are hints that that was the case. Well, that's got nothing to do with Homo sapiens as we know ourselves to be. That's totally outside of the line of our evolution as we understand it. But the moment you realize we're in a populated cosmos, we're a curated species, we've had a lot of help, and that when the Elohim in the Bible say, let's make humans to look like one of us, all that suggests there may be other people who look very much like us elsewhere in the cosmos.
Yeah.
And so not only are we not alone, but the life forms that we're looking for on other planets might not just be some bizarre form of moss that we've never seen before, but might be people who look very much like we do. And that is certainly what emerges in the stories of the ancients.
Yeah. And I know exactly what you're saying because that is the truth. And I visited with one from the Pleiades a year ago. His name is Jerry Wills, here a good friend in Arizona. And he was a drop-off. They dropped him off as a baby here. He got adopted and he grew up, and they came and visited him several times during his lifetime. At one time, he had a hard time, and they asked him, if you want to come back with us, you can, but he selected to stay. And he's a phenomenal, incredible man. I guess you're going to do an interview with him shortly.
Yes, he's interviewing me in a couple of weeks' time. And Jerry is a fascinating guy with a fascinating story, very compelling speaker indeed. And his story sounds incredible if you're not
Yeah,
familiar with that kind of story, but it's one of many. And
yeah,
I'm very fortunate in my position as a writer and a YouTuber. People will often watch a video on Fifth Kind TV and they'll think, I think I can tell my story to Paul. So I hear a lot of individual stories from people all around the world who say, just as you said, I think I've had contact
yeah,
with Pleiadian people. I think I may have been a drop-off or a star child. And these are contemporary stories, but there's a continuity that you can go back and listen to Cherokee's story, and they'll talk about people from the Pleiades. You can go into Armenia and to the ancient site at Karahunj, and you realize the people who built that 12,000 years ago had their sites on the constellation of Cygnus. And the place is called Karahunj. It means the speaking stones, and it hints at they're wanting contact with the people from Cygnus.
yeah,
Other story talks about beings from Sirius. Other story talks about beings from Orion.
yeah. The
And
Dogon people.
that's right. So the Dogon people talk about Sirius and the triple star system there, with precise astronomical information embedded in their ancient story, information we didn't have until the
Yeah,
20th century, which
yeah,
makes it really intriguing.
yeah,
So when people say to me, how come, if there's ET visitation going on, how come we never see them? How come we never hear from them? How come there's never contact with members of the public? How come it's always members of military intelligence who seem to have access to what they now call non-human intelligence? And the answer to that is, it is not only military intelligence who are having contact experiences. It's not only US Defense Force personnel who are having close encounters. And according to the official report, on average, once every 6 weeks, that's encounters that impinge on the activities of American defense forces. It's not just happening to those people, it is happening to regular people all around the world. If you don't know it, it's only because people don't go around telling those stories because they know they're going to be ridiculed.
yeah,
And I find that a lot of people contact me and tell their stories because they don't have anyone else to share it with, because they know it sounds ridiculous.
yeah,
They know they'll be laughed at. They know they won't be believed. But through my exposure to people like that from all around the world, I've come to a very confident conclusion that we are in contact at every level of society and have been for a long time and probably have always been.
yeah. I think so. Absolutely. And gosh, I'm looking at the clock and I see we're pretty much out of time. Let me one more time. Uh, please tell people where they can get a hold of you, where they can get the books, and maybe
For
what
sure.
you do next.
Well, to watch my documentaries, you can go to Fifth Kind on YouTube. That's the number 5, fifth kind. Or go to the Paul Wallis channel. I'm in the comments every day talking to people. You can go to my website, paulanthonywallace.com, if you want to send me a longer message. And for my books, which are Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, The Invasion of Eden, and now the new book, The Eden Enigma. Go to Amazon, you'll find them all there. And the latest two, The Invasion of Eden and The Eden Enigma, are in paperback only, which I'm sorry to say is protecting me from piracy. But if you get hold of that books and you want to talk to me about what you're finding there, come to my website and I'll be more than happy to get into a conversation with you.
Yes. Oh man, this has been wonderful. And we have known, Nori and I have known you for, I think the first interview was about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes, 5 years ago, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. Time goes fast when you're having fun.
It does. But what a great time to be doing work like this, Aage.
Yes, it really is. I am so lucky to be able to rub shoulders with people like you, the cream of the crop of the researchers and the writers, the people that have excellent information to give to people that need it. And we are so appreciative of that.
Well, thank you, Aage. I love what you do. I think the platform you created here is really important, and the appetite for the kind of information you're bringing in your channel is just so needed in these days.
Yeah. We're all doing our part. So anyway, thank you very much for being with us. And I know we'll do this again.
Thanks, Aage. Yes, I'll look forward to it. I'll see you next time.
Yeah, okay. So, and then if you like what you heard, folks out there watching and listening, please subscribe because that would really help us a lot. And I thank you very much. And until next time, be good to each other.